we continue with today's panels. This second panel, we will move from the battlefields to a more broader perspective, to a broader framework. In this case, to tackle the case study of the China-US competition and the future of the global order. This panel, if I'm not mistaken, will combine analysis in international relations, geopolitical analysis, and also strategic foresight, which I think it's a very relevant combination, and which is not a coincidence that at SEM we were doing this autumn a class that combined those three disciplines in the strategic studies executive course. And this panel will be conducted by Velina Tchakarova, who is a geopolitical strategist, also a certified strategic foresight expert, and the founder of the geopolitical consultancy FACE, which is for a conscious experience. And she's also the former head of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Austria, the main think tank in that country, and currently a professor of international relations at the Sigmund Freud Privatuniversität in Vienna. I then leave the floor to you, and later on we will have the aftermath, the Q&A.
Thank you very much to the audience. Indeed, very bright and engaging audience, which is why I'm looking forward especially to the Q&A session, where we will be engaging on the topics I will present. Small clarification, I'm not a professor at the Sigmund Freud Institute. I was having the lecture on theories of international relations, but my career is mostly located on the side of consulting public and private sector on global power shifts and geopolitical risks, trends and scenarios. That's my work. From time to time I give lectures, of course, with great pleasure, but academia is not my main field of work. Today I have received a very interesting topic, and that's the topic of the future of the global order on the one side, and obviously that's also a topic that's linked to the relationship between the two most powerful actors on the global arena, which are the United States and China. So in that sense, you see the title, I will try to present some assessment on the current scenarios regarding the global order. And of course, I will try also to give you the background of the US-China relationship from the perspective of the theoretical angle of, and it was already mentioned, Mackinder, Spikeman, and of course this kind of realpolitik school, geopolitics/geoeconomics /realpolitik school of thought. So this is the theoretical background. I'm not going to talk about any theoretical approaches today, but just to give you a sense from which corner I look at these processes. And I will start with a very short introduction that in the last 35 years we moved from the post-Cold War optimism and the supremacy of a sole victor in the first Cold War to the period of post-globalization fracture, which is the current state of the international affairs. It's a phase which bears a question mark. Nobody can tell for sure how the global order will look like. So if there is anybody from the field of international relations or political science who is making this claim that the global order will look like that or that, I mean, they are actually lying to you. And same goes for me. I have a specific idea, and I am also kind of located, or let's say positioned between two main scenarios right now, which I would like to present to you. And the base scenario I'm working with right now is what I describe or define as New Cold War between the United States on the one hand and, of course, the United States with no longer Euro-Atlantic, but more specifically transatlantic partners and allies, and China and Russia on the other. And I would like to also present you the base case for the China-Russia relationship. Now, why New Cold War 2.0, you might ask. And if you remember, just recently there was an interesting speech by Hegseth, the State Secretary of Defense / war, as they claim to be right now, where he actually put the question where we are right now in terms of the international relations. And he asked whether we are in the 1918 period or the 1939 period. Question mark. He did not give an answer to this question. So obviously, the current American administration is also trying to find an answer to this question. So here is where I step in and provide, let's say, attempt to answer the question. So I argue that we are not in the 1918, nor in the 1939 period, for a very obvious reason. That is the possession of nuclear weapons. The possession of nuclear weapons, in my view, reduces the incentive between the major great powers on the global arena to get involved in a direct conventional confrontation. That's my first, let's say, thesis on which I built the case for New Cold War instead of, let's say, World War III or hot war, as many media or analysts are claiming nowadays. There is a responsibility, but also pragmatism on behalf of the most important great powers. And we can, of course, also argue and discuss what great power means nowadays, whether it's a systemic power. I consider only two powers to be systemic powers these days, and these are the United States and China, and Russia is on its, let's say, on its path towards, let's say, comeback to be a great power, thanks to its modus operandi of strategic coordination with China. But anyway, there is the possession of nuclear power, of nuclear weapons, which is the biggest hurdle for these three to get engaged in a direct conventional confrontation. So we are now basically again at the beginning of 1945-47, with the big exception, or let's say big difference, that nobody has written the long telegram yet. So we do not know exactly who is going to write the long telegram this time. We shall see. Or maybe there is no need for such long telegram, because if we consider all the official statements on behalf of this US administration, I think that there is a clear declaration, let's say, of an overt competition in all strategically important domains. If we listen to the statements, if we read these documents from the last 9 months, and I will go through some of these fields, I would argue that probably we will not need any long telegram this time. The second important element of this new code, War 2.0, is the element of gray zone, because there is a clear understanding of a threshold which is not supposed and allowed to be transpassed. That is the threshold of a conventional warfare between the three. Anything below this threshold is allowed and desired. And I would argue we are already in this global gray zone warfare context. And this context entails already the full spectrum of what is often being described as hybrid warfare. But let's be real, if you take a look at the playbook of the first Cold War, you have a very good idea already what hybrid warfare is. There is nothing new actually there, except for the fact that technology has, of course, provided more means and more tools. So it's expanded playbook thanks to the technological progress. There is an expanded playbook of the so-called hybrid warfare, but if you take a look at the list of the different operations and instruments and tools, there's pretty much, you get pretty much the idea of what's happening right now. And of course, the third component is because of the globalization, the scope and scale of globalization from the last 25 to 30 years, again, before we entered this post-globalization fracturing period, we are now all, to some extent, and in different kind of scope, interconnected with each other, which created, of course, unanticipated levels of interdependence, and this interdependence is now actually being weaponized, what we call the weaponization of everything, because what was a leverage before can be turned into a liability nowadays. This is happening, of course, on all sides. So it's not only happening on behalf of the three great, let's say, players, those that are able and willing to play the long game, but it's happening also at the meta level of international relations. These are the regional players that are currently navigating between this, let's say, between this triangle and between these two poles of power, and are trying, of course, to not only benefit from this triangulation, but also to avoid taking sides, because currently avoiding taking sides gives you more leverage than actually siding with the one or the other. But not for a long time, because at some point of time also, if these, as we've seen also during the first Cold War, this decoupling and this process of confrontation becomes too intense, then the pressure on the meta level of international relations will become higher and higher, and regional players will be confronted with the ultimate, let's say, decision to take a side. So, to sum it up, what I've actually elaborated on so far, at the top of the system, at the top of the global system, for the very first time, global capitalist system, due to the globalization, we see bifurcation. That means all socioeconomic networks are currently facing objective systemic processes of splitting along two power centers. And at the same time, you go a level below, and at the meta level of the international relations, this is where you see all this multipolarity, as it is being claimed by the majority of scholars and experts, where there is an intense competition between key players in every corner of the world to kind of navigate, hedge, balance between, let's say, the United States, China, and Russia, and at the same time try to maximize their own gains. Now, let me say a few things about the dragon bear. This is a term I coined back in 2015. this is the period when I started realizing that there is a systemic approach behind the rapprochement between China and Russia. Now, in 2013, you know that there was a very big political shift in China. Xi Jinping came to power, and starting immediately after that, one interesting process that started and actually was deepened in 2014. You know what happened in 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine. And basically, Russia was facing, in the period between 2014 and 2015, an existential crisis, a crisis that was similar to the 1997 default situation, not only related to the currency, but also to the economy. Basically, this was the first period of Western sanctions, and you get the idea. So there was one major player at the time, and it was China, that actually stepped in and officially not just did the messaging in terms of international media or international partners, but actually proactively decided to come to the rescue through very different mechanisms. So from that time onwards, we are now in a situation where in 2022, first and foremost in 2021, for me it was much easier to do the strategic assessment on the exact time frame of the Russian war, how the Russian war will be framed. And I was basically almost on all points, except for the full scale, that means for an invasion coming from 5 different directions. Except for this, I was correct on all the other points of the Russian war planning. And one major aspect that was neglected up until that time, and was basically neglected even after 2022, was the aspect of this strategic coordination between China and Russia. Now, of course, 3.5 years later, it's very difficult for the Western elites to neglect this systemic phenomenon. And the very fact that the Chinese foreign minister has openly admitted in a meeting with the European Union top diplomat Kaja Kallas that it's not in the Chinese interest to let Russia lose the war against Ukraine, because otherwise, we know for a fact, the expectation is that the US will have finally the time to refocus on the Indo-Pacific, specifically on China. That is now the manifestation, if you wish, of the dragon bear. What was the dragon bear in 2015? It was a term that described at that time, modus vivendi, emerging modus vivendi of strategic coordination in all systemically relevant domains between China and Russia. As simple as that. Purely simple definition. Systemically relevant domains, of course, including raw materials, resources, access to these raw materials, going to or let's say stretching to existentially important fields for both sides. At that time, of course, also a major achievement was the settlement of the common border, so that no military conflicts were possible or anticipated and expected. And of course, then we move to the domains of technology, defense, space, and so on. And 10 years later, we have clear indicators, quantitatively and qualitatively, that actually point to a scalability, point to growing intensification of the coordination, and I really want to avoid the word of cooperation, because to me coordination points more to interoperability. Cooperation necessitates, of course, much larger and very often vague base of coming together. So in that sense, this dragon bear relationship, which started as a modus vivendi, has meanwhile, turned or evolved into a modus operandi. It has been institutionalized top-down. Strictly, it started as a top-down relationship, which was not even welcomed by the very own elites around Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They were questioning at the beginning the sense, the purpose of this relationship. It was strictly top-down. It was facilitated by very close circles around Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Now, meanwhile, of course, if you take a look and if you Google all the different platforms, commissions, and meetings that are happening in bilateral terms throughout the year, you will find plenty of examples for how the relationship works, not only at the level of the meetings between Xi Jinping and Putin, but at the level of prime minister or foreign minister or defense minister and so on. That's now a reality that is being considered as the new normal. But again, just 10 years ago, it was even questioned by the very same elites of the two countries. If I'm correct with my counting, because nobody can tell the right number, so I'm questioning my number as well, we are meanwhile at the 47th meeting between Xi Jinping and Putin since 2013. Okay, so one big thesis I want to propagate today is the thesis that when we regard, or if we regard or assume that the global order is going towards new Cold War, then please consider that it's not just about China on the other side, but it's about China and Russia. Russia benefits from the transformation of the global system. It's not only benefiting conventionally now, because it was able to launch the biggest conventional war on the old continent since the end of the Second World War, thanks to this modus operandi. It has, and we can argue, of course, that Putin has miscalculated many things at the beginning of the war. But on one matter, he did not miscalculate. And it was the matter how China will react to the conventional war of Russia. Second important point, why is it relevant, and we should really, really talk about it, is that, of course, it is not just about Ukraine. It is about the new security architecture in Europe, which more or less is a kind of a split between China and Russia, where Russia is taking care of the European continent, while China, and I'll think again of Mackinder, what he actually foresaw, basically thanks to the technological revolution, where he actually foresaw that China would rise because of the technological revolution. And if we mix Mackinder and Spikeman, we could also argue that China would be the first hybrid power, combining both the Eurasian landmass and the maritime space, which is basically what China is doing in the Indo-Pacific. It doesn't want only to control the Indo-Pacific, it also wants to control the Eurasian landmass. But how is it going to control the Eurasian landmass without the blessing of the country with the largest nuclear arsenal? So that means a kind of a split of roles, where now that a third frontier is being opened in the Arctic, the only way how China can become an Arctic nation and can actually be able to position itself there and create an alternative maritime line to the most important, the most vital maritime line and trade line from a European perspective, that is the Indo-Pacific one, is through the entry ticket being Russia. So China is now positioning itself in the Arctic, also thanks to the Dragon Bear, where it is facilitating. They already have announced it, and I can confirm for you that 2025 marks the beginning of the facilitation of the so-called Arctic. The Chinese are calling it the Polar Silk Road. The Russians are calling it the Northern Sea Route, but that's now actually a new maritime route, trade route, and the access to the vast resources of the Arctic. Not only fossil fuels, but also minerals, rare earths, all of the things that we will need for the big transformational processes happening in the next 5, 10, 15 years. Good. Now I come to Trump 2.0. And I regard Trump not as the one who started the rivalry, because this is his second term. So the rivalry, the systemic rivalry between the United States and China did not start with Trump. I regard Trump as a symptom, if you wish, as an accelerator of these transformational processes, but certainly not as the trigger for the rivalry. And because of him being a factor of acceleration, some might call him a fire starter, use whatever metaphor you like, but now a lot of this ambiguity is being removed and the masks are off. And as I said, this US administration wants openly and overtly to compete with the Chinese, which of course pushes us on all into this openly transactional, but at the same time hardcore power politics, which especially the Europeans are not used to it, where the European elites and the institutional elites right now in Brussels are struggling to, cope with and come up with any adequate plans. So the way I see it is that both sides, China and the United States, are in need of partners and allies. Now, we saw already what this US administration understands under allies and partners. There is an entry ticket, there is a membership fee, whether it's called a tariff or whether it's called higher percentage of GDP for defense spending, but there will be a higher cost of participation in the US-led bloc. And we saw already that some of the key Anglosphere partners, the traditional ones like the Brits, like Australia, Canada, have, despite domestic narratives, how quickly they actually started siding with the Americans on key domains like energy, technology, security and defense, access or production of raw materials and rare earths. So we have plenty of examples already in only 9-10 months from now. Same happens with China-Russia. It's not just the China-Russia axis. Again, here I would like to stress that there is no need for these two countries, once being the most adversarial neighbors, historically and traditionally quite hostile to each other. So never in the history of the bilateral relationship they have been so close. There is no need for any military pact or strategic alliance. So if the question arises, yeah, but they haven't signed anything, my answer to you will be because they don't need to enter strategic alliance in the traditional understanding of strategic alliances, how we understand them in the West, based on a very broad fundament of values or ideals or shared goals and visions and so on and so forth. They do share strategic vision. One, for instance, is that a global order dominated by American supremacy and American power projection is a no-go from both sides. They do share, indeed, geopolitical goals. They do share a common fear, one being internal destabilization, or, if you wish, in both cases, still very valid, dissolution of their own countries. That's a very real fear. So they have, we could discuss this as well, but I'm not sure we will have the time for that. But anyway, China and Russia axis has a certain powerful appeal to third countries through various means. Now, China, obviously, through the means of, the legacy of China is obviously more geo-economic based, whereas Russia has, of course, successfully revived traditional networks of influence all over the world, from Latin America to Africa to Asia, and even here in Europe, has successfully referred to old and traditional channels of influence and so on. So they have also managed to find third partners. Now, you probably have heard, just to give one example, because, as I said, I would like to only focus on the systemic issues. Here we have no time for the details, unfortunately. But just to give you one example, you have certainly heard of this new term, CRINCS, which is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So you get the idea. And even now when, for instance, a military operation is being considered or is being speculated about by the United States on Venezuela, you clearly see the dividing line, how the current leadership around Maduro is relying on the very same actors as a backup of his power. And at the same time, if we refer to the current reporting, there are conversations between Maduro and the Trump administration about the possible kind of solution to avoid the military intervention. Again, what's one of the conditions? Well, it is to actually give up on the support. First and foremost, to give up on the supply, the oil supply to China. Second, to give up on the support coming from Russia and Iran and so on. So again, this kind of dividing lines you can find currently in many of the so-called hotspots in various conflicts or even wars around the world. So to sum it up, the new global order is currently not multipolar, but actually, if you take a look at the patterns of behavior of the global system, if you consider the global system as a whole, consisting of its socio-economic networks, then it actually shows patterns of behavior of a rather bifurcating system. That means splitting into bi-block system, with a lot of multipolar features in all these regional arenas of competition. So the global system is not just bifurcating into competing blocks, but it's also facing fragmentation, and at the same time, as the fragmentation is increasing, so is the attempt towards more regional integration. That's why you are observing, for instance, many cases of bilaterals, trilaterals, or multilaterals at regional level. Then, of course, I already addressed the issue of the dragon bear as modus operandi, meanwhile. That means as a strategic choice aimed at displacing the US-led order, as an axis that seeks to fill the vacuum and shape the global order in accordance with the overlapping Chinese and Russian interests. And another major question mark, another critical uncertainty is linked to the role of the so-called middle powers. All of these key players that have certain leverage in the global system, for instance, through the access to raw materials or through the location along a critical supply chain or through the location, let's say, in a global choke point. So these middle powers do not necessarily have to be big-sized countries. On the opposite, you see, for instance, the example of Taiwan, which has a critical technology, which is the chips. So it's not the size that matters, it's much more than that. But if you are able to capitalize on a certain geopolitical leverage, that makes you obviously part of this bigger actors' constellations and power struggles. And in that sense, I consider many of these middle powers as power brokers because, again, right now the play is to rather exercise equidistance, often equidistance rather than alignment. Now, the pushback coming from China and the United States will be towards alignment. You have to pick a side. And I don't have an answer to you whether or how long this game will take. We clearly see in the example of Europe how equidistance is no longer paying off. Now, the Europeans would like to keep the Americans as a strategic partner when it comes to security and defense, but at the same time they propagate that it makes perfect sense to deepen the relationship with China in the geoeconomic domain, right? Remember the de-risking approach, which strategically makes little sense if you regard the long game, because basically what would happen is that the Europeans, if they would successfully deepen the relationship with China, they would basically prolong the war of Russia against Ukraine, as we now know that China is a systemic backer of Russia. So strategically, it doesn't make sense. Clearly, equidistance was the right strategy for a long time, but then again, at some point of time, there will be this really hard choice to be made. And Europe, as I claim, is the perfect example for that. Now, there is another important systemic process whose outcome, whose finality is not clear. We do not have an answer to that. So, as you see, I have more questions for you rather than answers. But I would also argue that if we engage intellectually and scientifically with these critical uncertainties, and if we try to find some answers to the unknown unknowns, if we deal with the unknown unknowns, we would be better off in the long term rather than trying to figure out things that are quite certain, such as, for instance, demographic decline or climate change related activities. So here we are, it's a decoupling process, which also to a great extent is an objective systemic process. So that means that on the American side, administrations will come and go, but this interest in continuing the decoupling will be here to stay. It did not start with Trump. Obama's administration actually started a process of institutional decoupling. And Xi Jinping, right from the beginning of his rise, actually started the process on the Chinese side. Now, the question here is how long, with what intensification, and with what final outcome, because we cannot find any answer in 250 years of, let's say, industrializations and globalization's attempts and global power rise. We have no answer because the entanglement between China and America was also a unique process. So how will this entanglement affect the global order, and what kind of effects it will have on the behavior of state actors? That's a major question to answer. But what we know for sure is that there is a mutual readiness to continue with this process on both sides. And as I already mentioned, the risking, in my view, is no long-term strategy. It's actually the recipe to slow that. What is happening here, by the way, slow that is not my term. I'm referring to a speech by the French President Macron at the Sorbonne University. But the expectation is that this reduction of mutual dependence in critically important domains is going to continue. From supply chains, that's why we are all feeling the inflationary pressure, because the disruption of the supply chains did not start with the pandemic. The pandemic was a manifestation of the real cost of a sudden disruption of supply chains. But think about the slow and steady disruption of supply chains for the sake of this entanglement. China is obviously right now more or less on the winning side of controlling supply chains, of being the major manufacturing power, of controlling major production and mining of rare earths. So both sides are equalizing themselves in different domains. But the point here is, again, when it comes to the interplay of all of these levels and all of these networks, from supply chains to tech to economy and trade, to raw materials, energy, food, fertilizers, agriculture, to capital markets, financialization, and at the end, security, defense, space. This is a very, very long game and a very long term on both sides. Now, let me talk you through a little bit of the concrete fields, what's happening right now. Now, all of you have a pretty good idea about the trade war ongoing between the two states. Again, here, this is not the point of discussing in detail what exactly has happened in terms of decision making between the American and the Chinese leadership. But it's more about pointing to the trajectory of the trend. And the trend in 2025 is quite clear. And that is that, yes, tariffs are just one of many components of the trade and the economic decoupling that will be happening between the two systemic rivals. So, from my background, tariffs were not a surprise. And I'm not going to discuss whether tariffs are good or not, or whether they are tax or not. That's not the purpose of this conversation. This is here just a signal. One of many when it comes to the decoupling in the trade and economic field. There is a clear asymmetry here. As you know, one being, of course, linked to the manufacturing power of China, another being linked to the asymmetry in terms of deficits on behalf of United States, third being linked to the ambition of United States to come back as a manufacturing power, whether successful or not, big question mark. And fourth, obviously linked to the realization that all of these are to be seen as vulnerabilities from the moment whether you have the critical raw materials or not, whether you have the rare earths for the digital or energy transformation, whether you have the rare earths for the defense sector. And then again, you need all the semiconductors for the digital transformation because we are in the middle of a fourth industrial revolution. And then, of course, the realization that China, meanwhile, has become trading partner number one of most of the world. And that is a significant leverage. It's a significant channel of political influence when it comes to shaping the global order in accordance to the own understanding and national interest. So tariffs are to be considered, or at least I consider them, as structural and not temporary, but it's a whole package of measures and tools that we need to factor in, such as sanctions. Sanctions are also, coming on both sides. Export controls, a very typical example nowadays, if you consider how, for instance, China reacted to the tariffs. And I call it, or let's say I refer to the term that some state actors and experts have introduced, the weaponization of everything. That means weaponization of access, creating scarcity context, because we live more or less, if you take a look at the availability of raw materials, we actually live in a context of abundance, but now one way how you can weaponize this context is by creating a state of scarcity. China has been doing this successfully with the rare earths exports. By the way, we Europeans also felt the pressure. And, it was one way how to react to the tariffs policy of the Americans, which is why now maybe there will be a question, which I will immediately want to respond to in advance, about the typical TACO stance. Trump always chickens out when it comes to the tariffs, right? And here my response, right in advance, because I've been receiving this question for many, many times, is that the point is not that China could exercise pressure as a response to the launch of the tariffs, and by that could remove, a major leverage of tariffs, for instance, from them to go from 145% or 100% to, let's say, only 43% or whatever kind of number we want to use. The point here is that we have now a situation where we have much higher tariff than originally was the case between the United States and China. So we ended up with a higher tariff situation. That's what I want you to consider as a strategic rationale behind the tariffs. So in the end, it doesn't matter how you will describe it, because if you end up with much higher tariff, that's the new status quo, that's the new situation. Now, do not put China-US tariff dispute into any context on par with the rest of the world. This is a systemic relationship. It is a long game again. That means it will undergo many ups and downs. You cannot compare it, because I've been receiving these questions about, for instance, India, which is now more sanctioned than China. It has currently it has 50% tariff, 25% base tariff, plus additional 25% for the Russian oil imports. And again, this is a very different scale of relationship. So you cannot compare it. That's very important to understand, that there is a realization on both sides, United States and China, that they need to find a kind of middle ground, because acceleration in any of these fields is detrimental to the interest. They cannot allow the whole system to go into a collapse mode. So there is a pragmatism here that has nothing to do with the rest of the world, because they consider themselves as being, already at a higher level of global affairs, and more specifically because any of their decision, considering the bilateral relationship, has immediate cascading effects on the whole. So that is one clarification I want to make. Of course, we are dealing with techno-nationalism, and I will be talking a little bit about the technological domain as well. And yes, the logic is openly block building, one, with us versus with China. So there is this kind of mindset now on both sides when it comes to critical technologies or ports or data or regional organizations and partnerships, pick whatever domain you like, which has existential meaning. Now, China and Russia are basically, and here, of course, Russia is the wild card in this triangular relationship, because Russia does not have the scalability of United States and China when it comes to geoeconomic power projection. It has been already mentioned by the previous panelist at AIES. It still possesses vast resource portfolio that will be serving as an enabler in combination with the largest industrializing power and the biggest manufacturing power, which is China, without a doubt. But here, of course, Russia sees this immense opportunity to ride the wave of the fourth industrial revolution with the help of China. We are already observing this enabling force, for instance, in the Russian war against Ukraine, even though that first, let's say, qualitative proofs are coming right now when it comes to technological support, or when it comes to the chips or the dual-use items. We will be receiving much more proof, I can assure you of that, as the war will continue, because Russian war, as it was already mentioned, is with or without peace process is going to continue beyond 2032 framework. So in that sense, China is not giving up on Russia, and that is one way how also this kind of enforcement architecture is projecting its appeal on third countries, what third countries could expect from a collaboration and coordination with Russia. Now, we have also, of course, other ways of decoupling, and one way is through the financial flows, and, a big discussion is linked to the whole de-dollarization topic. Right now, we are not in a de-dollarization context. In fact, if you take a look at the data, if you take a look at the analysis linked to the global financial system and the global capital flows, we are still in a highly dollarized world. But the point I want to make here is actually to move away from the traditional understanding, because what we are going to see here in this particular domain is not going to be a replacement of the dollar. There is going to be an alternative, if you wish, a shadow financial system that's going to be facilitated by China with third countries, because a lot of the partners of China are already the most sanctioned countries. So these countries have already found ways of using, back channels, or if you wish, shadow channels. Sometimes it's even a traditional barter system. So we do not have the metrics to actually measure de-dollarization, or probably we should consider, more traditional metrics to measure de-dollarization, such as I said, the scope of barter system, or the way how, shadow fleet. If you have a shadow fleet, for instance, you must have also shadow banking system, right? Because there are a lot of payments that are happening behind the traditional patterns of financial banking. So this is one way how I would like to draw your attention to these new realities, not in terms of simplification that, yes, in the next, let's say, 3 or 5 years, there will be a new currency that is going to replace the dollar. That's not what's going to happen. It's going to be a slow and steady process of the manifestation of a new system that does not entail the Western financial institutions and payment systems and currencies. That's also one way of operating, let's say, in the shadow of the current global system, while creating. Well, first, you're penetrating the global system, but second, you're also creating an alternative one as your hedge plan. This is what powers do in preparation for their rise. Now, this is also not something new, but it's the old scramble for corridors. And you remember it was a big topic before the beginning of the First World War. It has always been a topic throughout, the history of international relations, and that is how big powers, great powers, actually create connectivity to enable the flow of goods or labor or capital or financial means and so on and so forth. And right now we are once again, to use the traditional cliche, in a scramble of geoeconomic corridors, where we have the clear example of each one of these powers of trying to create their own connectivity around the world. Now, the United States, I think, is a very good example with, obviously, with global, with actually being the only state actor operating as a global, or let's say in the context of a global power projection, thanks to its maritime strength. So there is nothing new there. But, China, you remember 2013, the BRI was announced. At that time, one belt, one road, and actually everybody was laughing at that as a marketing scheme. Nobody was taking this seriously. I can assure you about that because we did many public discussions at the time. I remember exactly how experts were describing it. Meanwhile, BRI, most of the actually successful connectivity projects are defined as BRI projects, and obviously it's one way to consider how China wants to project global power via the creation of different terrestrial and maritime corridors. Now, Russia, meanwhile, because of the Western sanctions, has successfully managed, after 2022, after 20 years of negotiations, in fact, to finally operationalize the international North-South transport corridor that connects Russia with India via South Caucasus and Iran. And it was a big success because meanwhile they have also managed to relaunch a Cold War corridor, which was the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor. Now consider these two corridors in the bigger picture, what we are discussing right now, and you get the idea, because what will be the next? Next will be that the state actor that's en route to becoming world's economic power number 3, that's India, is going to logically connect itself also from Vladivostok through the new Arctic route, facilitated by China and Russia, to the European markets. Now, of course, from Indian perspective, optionality is also everything. So it's not like there is an emphasis on a specific corridor. Everybody is struggling to come up with optionality in terms of corridors. Now, India, again, has managed to successfully announce an economic corridor connecting it with the Gulf states, with Israel, and with the European states. That's the IMEC corridor. Which unfortunately, because of the events in the Middle East, it was announced in September 2023, and then of course was put on hold because of all the realities in the Middle East, starting with the 7th of October 2023. Now, America, under this leadership, has come up also with the revival of the Monroe Doctrine. You remember all of the headlines about Panama, about Canada becoming the 51st state, and then of course now with the realities when it comes to Venezuela or even other Latin American countries, and all of this is not just a hype. If you put this into the context of a scramble of for geoeconomic corridors, you understand that the calculus of great powers is very different from the calculus of any other state actor. That it's really about the competition, who's going to facilitate the most successful flow of all these important existential, actually, flows. Flow of goods or products or data or labor or capital or whatever you would like to pick, especially in the context of the globalization. Now, speaking also of the technological domain, this is basically one of the key domains because of the mindset on both sides that the winner takes all. And it's a mindset that goes back to the First Cold War, because this was basically the domain. At that time, it was about the Third Industrial Revolution, which let's say, regarding the mindset of the American leadership, has been decisive also for the victory over the Soviet Union, because the Americans were able not just to compete, but to win the Third Industrial Revolution against the Soviet Union. In a sense, there was this understanding that this was decisive also for the victory in the Cold War. And now, if we take a look on both sides, the statements, the readiness to compete technologically, there is a similar winner-takes-all mindset on both sides. So there are statements on both sides pointing to this kind of determination and mindset that whether it's AI or other technologies, that this will be the game changers for global power dominance and for supremacy. Or differently put, technological supremacy would be decisive or axiomatically decisive for the outcome of this new Cold War. So here we have many examples, meanwhile, how this, on the one hand, decoupling is taking place, but also how both sides would like to compete with one another. Currently, AI is basically the big game, where China has this clear path of development and clear strategy to achieve self-reliance in major technological domains. Also, if you consider the competition right now between both, it's not clear who is going to win. So we, again, have rather question mark than definitive outcome and a clear answer. So we are really in the middle of it. We don't know exactly how long it will take for these two to compete. We cannot use any previous analogies or references because it's a very different acceleration right now as compared to the first Cold War. And we have an interplay of different components. So it's not just the AIs, it's the semiconductors, it's the regulation or the lack of such, is the way how they are going to involve third actors to be part of this competition. It's the telecommunication, it's the industrial base or the lack of such. It's the data sovereignty regime. Some are defining the American way of the wild, wild west of technology. On the other hand, some are referring to the Chinese approach, interestingly enough, given that it's Communist Party leadership, but still they are, for instance, referring to as to being much more open and much more inviting for third to participate when it comes to the way how the Chinese are now also not just catching up, but according to some even overshadowing the American progress in the field. But the one way or the other, the US-China tech war is to be considered as the core of the Cold War 2.0. It's not just a separate, tech is not just a separate sector, it is the operating system of power projection. Also, it will be relevant for the narratives that will be spread. I would consider that at some point of time in the future we might witness a situation where, for instance, countries like China and Russia, which are already fully dominating the information flow, that's nothing new, that happened also in the first Cold War, but will probably create a kind of separate zone. So we might end up with the scenario, I'm just saying scenario, of separate internet space and separate ecosystems when it comes to these technologies. But certainly AI is to be considered as a game changer, and the technology domain will be decisive also for the progress when it comes to the transformation towards new energy sources. Every industrial revolution is about adding an additional energy source or transforming at least one energy source. And at the same time, it's going to be decisive also about the technological progress, which will also be linked to a lot of dual use, and will be linked to the military-industrial complex, and will be linked also to the space exploration and the space competition. So all of it is kind of linked to each other. And last but not least, of course, it's linked also to the fourth domain of warfare, which is new as compared to the previous warfare of the first Cold War, which is the cyber domain. So in that sense, one thing is clear as of today. China will never accept permanent technological inferiority, will compete with all means, all sources, all strength it has. It will never accept the supremacy of America. And at the same time, of course, the American mindset is that, the US was at the core of the rise of China as a global power due to the entanglement. And now the US has to be at the core of China's demise. That's the mindset. Now, going to military security architecture and competition in the military domain and in the security military domain. As I already mentioned, this is a gray zone warfare already. It's actually interesting because whole of Europe is meanwhile a gray zone warfare arena. Since 2022, for sure, it has manifested itself as such, but the understanding and the mindset, the perception and the realization on behalf of the European elites and institutional representatives is missing. They do not handle it as such. Just to give you one example, because we are here in Europe. But Europe is not the main theater. And one reason why European elites are rendered geopolitically irrelevant, think of the fact that they haven't been included in any of the two tracks of actually any negotiations, the one being US-Russia and the other being Russia-Ukraine via US with US mediation. And they haven't been included in both. They have been informed. They have, of course, been invited and have been briefed, but that's not what actually participation on par really means. But the brutal reality is that Europe is not even the main theater. In this new Cold War, the main theater is the Indo-Pacific, which is not just about Taiwan, but it's actually about the whole region. First reason, because the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian bloc, is the fastest growing, economically growing part of the world. It still has a relatively positive demographic picture as well. Then India is located in South Asia. It's, as I already mentioned, becoming world's economic power number 3. It has managed its rivalry with China so far for pragmatic reasons. So they decided last year, and it was not because of Trump, I have to stress that, they have decided to actually engage in a normalization process, which is good for both countries, for China and India to actually have a positive economic growth outlook, and for other reasons as well. But the point is that South Asia, Southeast Asia, and then, of course, the whole Eurasian landmass, these are going to be more or less the major parts of the new kind of arena of competition. You've probably heard recently that there was a big summit between the United States and Central Asia. Central Asia is also very important for China and Russia. I already talked about the Arctic, and again, Taiwan, big question mark, Southeast Asia, very big question mark, how they will position themselves, for instance, in the case of intensifying competition. Some countries like the Philippines are already kind of siding with the United States, but also with big repercussions as, on the other hand, the level of militarization, the spectrum of hybrid warfare taking place every day in this region has never been that high, especially in the last 3-4 years. So again, that's just the beginning. It gives you the taste of what's going to happen. And just as we speak right now, there is a new example of a kind of diplomatic escalation between Japan and China, linked again to Taiwan. Taiwan is considered to be the central flashpoint where the PLA pressure is going to significantly increase in this through this grey zone coercion. But if you ask me again, because I suppose you will ask this question, whether China is considering a military attack on Taiwan. You know, all these kind of simulations, and there are a lot of speculations, especially coming from this administration right now, where we have a lot of China hoax, that China would consider a military attack by not later than 2027. I would not share this assessment. I'm not sharing this assessment, and I'm not right now, based on the interplay of signals and different variables. I just don't see this happening. Yes, by 2027, the expectation is that China will finally reach the level of military readiness. It's catching up militarily, will be able to attack Taiwan. But the question again is that the one doesn't automatically translate and convert into incentive to act militarily. And the reason why I think that China, unless there is a kind of black swan event, would not consider attack Taiwan militarily is because it has many good options from its perspective to actually annex Taiwan through a very, very efficient old Soviet tactic of full-scale penetration, again below the threshold of a conventional attack. That means long-term political, economic penetration, and it's coupled with social, fabric destruction. So the slow erosion of the social fabric of Taiwan, because Taiwan is the most vibrant democracy in the region. So because of that fact, it is quite vulnerable to this kind of approach. And the approach can go on for 5, 8, 10 years until a kind of tipping point is reached, where one beautiful day we just wake up to the news of a new reality, that there is a political party which actually propagates and calls for the integration into China, and you get the idea. So I would argue we are currently facing this Chinese approach of what I call death by 1,000 cuts, rather than the very risky and quite open to a lot of pushback and vulnerabilities, and you don't have the clear promise of a military victory scenario of a military attack on Taiwan. But okay, that's the reality. Again, below the threshold of a conventional warfare, full spectrum. Meanwhile, we are in 2025 already in a full spectrum of the hybrid operations there. And again, what we also have right now are all these kind of unilateral security and defense collaborations, and kind of web of partners on both sides. The Americans are also active when it comes to partners like Australia, or I already mentioned the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, India is also participating in the quadrilateral format. These are not institutional formats. We are not going to witness Asian NATO in the Indo-Pacific. So there won't be a pendant to the Euro-Atlantic alliance in the Indo-Pacific. This will be a very different kind of modus operandi of security and defense, pacts and cooperation, yet there will be an intensification on both sides as, again, this realization starts manifesting that the Indo-Pacific is going to be the strategic region where the Cold War 2.0 is going to kick in first and foremost. On behalf of China, Russia, a lot is happening as well. Russia has been kind of adding value to China through various military experience it already has. As I already mentioned, it's kind of the bully that China can rely on in the region. For instance, just recently they have trained amphibious operations, which would give us an idea, for instance, about a possible operation in Taiwan. So they have joint patrols, joint exercises, close to Japan, close to Taiwan, all of the time. Arctic is also one of the regions. There is a technological transfer. We know for a fact that there are efforts towards interoperability, similar to what's happening within NATO, even though that, again, there won't be any institutionalization. But the very fact, I mean, imagine how, Chinese and Russian soldiers are working closely with each other, communicating in Russian or Chinese, and trying actually to figure out how to be militarily more present. Then we have the big wild card named North Korea, which is going to be intensified in the years to come, not only because of the nuclear weapons, but also because of the military pact that has been signed between Russia and North Korea. So there are many geopolitical puzzle pieces to be considered on both sides. And just to give you one idea how this systems analysis can be also translated into daily, or into understanding of daily events, and could be helpful as foresight. To go back to Europe, because obviously we are in Europe, you would be more interested in learning about what it means for Europe. Well, if we anticipate a new Cold War, then there must be also a new Iron Curtain. Where would be this new Iron Curtain in your view? Well, one way of looking at that is that due to these major power shifts eastwards, right now this new Iron Curtain 2.0 could be erected along the eastern flank of NATO, where we have new members. In the north, Finland and Sweden, we have the major push coming from the Baltics and Poland, and then we have countries like Romania, Bulgaria close also to Turkey. Turkey will never accept new status quo in the Black Sea area, so there will be a reaction also on behalf of Turkey. And in that sense, we could expect that, probably this thesis now is in a major conflict with the thesis of the previous panelists about the European NATO and the NATO, but I do not consider the end of the NATO. I consider actually new tasks of NATO, because this is the zone where American cooperation and coordination will still be in place and will still be regarded actually as necessary. But there will be a split of roles. So the Europeans will have to take care of the old continent, while America will focus mostly on the Indo-Pacific. And what it means in real terms is that the lack of physical and dual use infrastructure, next to the lack of military infrastructure, is going to be the major gap that governments and institutions have to fill. So because we cannot move easily military equipment from the northern member states to Turkey. Try that. Try to travel from the north up until Bulgaria and Turkey, and let me know how the trip was. So the point here is that there will be a major stabilization effort. A lot of investments will be happening exactly in this geographic area. And paradoxically enough, this will be the eye of the storm and at the same time the most secure part. Similarly to what was happening during the First Cold War, where on both sides of the Iron Curtain, major deployment of military force, of soldiers, but also military equipment was facilitated. So, to wrap it up, we are somewhere here. I mean, I don't have, as I already warned you at the beginning, a clear answer what kind of global order we are going to face. Is it going to be a global peace, a global cold peace scenario, where the global status quo is going to continue to worsen? Still, we are going to be in a process of emergence of two blocks. So we are somewhere in the middle of these processes, with a lot of frozen conflicts, a lot of proxy wars between United States, China, and obviously Russia siding with China, as mentioned. And that will be a kind of scenario of continuous fragmentation and uneasy coexistence. Will be one way of looking at the future short to mid-term. Or is it a manifestation of Cold War, as I'm arguing, with economic trade and tech decoupling, which is going to further harden into military confrontation through proxy wars and through the participation in third parties' conflicts, something that we already witnessed during the First Cold War? Or is it in reality a scenario of chaotic and volatile multipolarity? Maybe the majority of the experts and scholars is right in claiming that the world is sliding into the emergence of 3, 4, 5 centers of power, where middle powers are exploiting the fractures, institutions, international institutions are collapsing, and more or less the world is concerned with ad hoc crisis management. All of this is question mark. So it's up to us to continue to observe, to be mindful of the global power shifts, to try to make sense of the world post-2025. But one way or the other, this global power competition is here to stay. This particular actors constellation right now between Trump and Xi Jinping and their teams is going to, in my view, accelerate the bloc building rather than reverse it. And the US-China contest is now operating across all these 5 particular domains I was talking about, such as trade, tech, finance, security, and information, and with all the deviations, because a lot of the issues that I touched upon are linked to the one or the other domain. Again, the dragon bear is here to stay. Yes, as many phenomena in international relations, it's not a constant. It's not eternal. There are no eternal partners and allies. Such is the case also with no eternal enemies. But the dragon bear is here to stay for a while, and this administration will not be able to lure Russia away from China, no matter how hard it tries, because we can argue that the US-Russia track that's happening right now, aside from the whole negotiations processes with, let's say, Ukraine and the Russians, which is a very different format, has to do with this global arena, has to do with this global power competition. But again, short term, I do not expect that it will bring about any change in the calculus in the Kremlin or in the calculus in Beijing. Long term, everything is possible. That means that this is just, in the grand scale of things, just a minor issue of the international relations. But for now, it's here to stay, and it is already affecting the interconnection of the hotspots. If you take a look at Ukraine, if you take a look at the Middle East, the position on Iran, the position on Syria, the position on Gaza. If you take a look at the Indo-Pacific, you're already finding out that it's an interconnected chessboard, where the Chinese and the Russian interests are actually overlapping to a great extent. Again, they are not identical, but when they are not identical or when they do not agree with each other, they do not confront each other, which is also a major issue to be considered. And Europe, in my view, whether it's about the institutional elite or it's about the political decision makers or the industries and companies, must shift from this passive hedging to an active design of resilience, scalability, optionality. A lot has been already mentioned by the previous panelists. I do not see this mindset currently being present. So I would not like to end with, my presentation with a, negative connotation, but I also want to remain realistic. So long as the mindset is missing, all the missing puzzle pieces of action and, strategy are not going to be in place either. So thank you very much for your patience, and I'm eager to answer any questions if there is still some time. If not, we can also do it during the lunch.
Thank you very much. Very interesting conference. Before just giving the floor, I'm going to get the privilege to ask first a question. Would you think that we are seeing this pattern towards power to two blocks building up? Are there any signs that there's an advantage from one of those two blocks to achieve self-reliance, or there is some sort of curse of interdependence that it's not going to be able to end up being a break?
There are many signs on both sides that there is a need to achieve self-reliance. Now, on the Chinese side, for obvious reason, it's at the core of the leadership, it's a Communist Party. Communist Party thinks in terms of, we've seen this before, that's why, I've lived on the other side of the Cold War, so I can assure you that that's nothing new that the Chinese are doing. It's, of course, new in terms of being much more technologically and, organizatorial terms perfected, but Communist Party thinks in terms of self-reliance, starting from the raw materials and stockpiling critical resources, whether it's food or energy, anything that's linked to the political stability at home, to, of course, hedging against any possible risks linked to, let's say, military scenarios or conflict scenarios. So that's already been done for a long time on behalf of China. And it's now, of course, being accelerated. That's why I cannot accept a statement when I hear someone in Europe and in the West claiming Russia is a junior partner of China. I cannot accept it as a serious statement, because Russia is critically important as a hedge in the self-reliance plan of China. Yes, we of course can argue that it's a junior partner when it comes to the asymmetries of the trade relationship and the economic relationship, yes. But it's a critically, existentially important partner when it comes to self-reliance. Now, United States, of course, is also moving from this mindset of interdependence towards the mindset of being self-reliant in critically important domains, from rare earths and raw materials to production lines and supply chains to defense, security, defense, and space. Yes, and now we can not wait in. We cannot clearly say who is winning this competition over self-reliance. I would even argue that even if both were now self-reliant, that would probably be a necessary but not the sufficient condition for winning the global competition. So that's something that is now just linked to the science of the time, but it's not in itself the only variable that we should be paying attention to. And yes, I have to again criticize the European mindset here, because think about what the European mindset was about the relationship with Russia. For 20 plus years, they pursued, and I can assure you that because I have been following this firsthand, they have pursued Russia first policy in the relations with the whole region, with the whole Eastern European region. It was not about Ukraine, it was not about Georgia, it was not about any of these countries, it was always about Russia first. In meaning, we have to respect the interests of Russia first and foremost if we are to shape any relationship with this region, and we would create an interdependence with Russia so that there is zero incentive in the leadership in Moscow to start any kind of conflictual relationship. And how did this go? Very well, right? Now the point is that they are trying instead of learning from their own mistakes, they're trying to, and I think it's, I'm not blaming them, I'm just making the realization. I think it's just a reflex. It's just a reflex of a mindset because they haven't dealt differently, that if we are increasing the interdependence with China, we will be on the safe side. If we deepen the relationship with China, there would be no incentive on behalf of China to act against us. And I would argue that in peace times, this might be a good strategy. But we are, as I already explained, no longer in peace times. So in war times, even if it's a gray zone warfare context, any vulnerability that emerges out of a too far stretching interdependence would be, axiomatically we can and should anticipate, would be weaponized, would be actually used as a form of political influence.
Okay. I've got more questions, but I see that there are many more in the public, so we'll go for questions to the public. I saw that Linda was just...
Yes, I'm going to make this very brief because I could make it very long. But you've been able to track this initiative through Putin's writings since at least 1997. In 1997, Alexander Dugin, under Putin's, he commissioned this, Osnovi geopolítiques, and that's Foundations of Geopolitics, which was almost an instruction manual for his plan to unite into Eurasia with China, and then use it as a power base to basically take over the world. And under this picture, Europe is simply on the periphery. He talked about it as the fringe territory that must be integrated eventually. Then, in 2006, shortly before he published Project Russia, he commissioned one of his favorite authors, Mikhail Yuriev, to publish hang on. I have to read it. Tretnia Imperia, the Third Empire, and it's Putin's pipe dream, the world he'd like to see. In Tretnia Imperia, there are 5 power bases. Russia is very dominant. The United States has been diminished in power, and there are basically 5 land masses that are integrated. There are no national borders. And it's, big powers duking it out. Then 2 years later, he began coming out with this 4-book series, Proyecto, which is his national ideology, and he began fleshing out his plans. Okay, hang on, because I'm going back to, okay. Then, Hybridnya Vojny, hybrid war, that was his integrated theory that included color revolution and proxy war, how to begin diminishing the national borders. And the deployment of migrants all over the world, pressuring countries, and this dissolution of national borders is part of the whole thing. And now you've got this Belt and Road Initiative. And Putin and China, like Russia and China, have persuaded a lot of countries to begin hooking up their national rail systems and other networks. And he pictures starting from the edge of Europe, right across the landmass, and then going across to through the corridor from Siberia to North America, an integrated network, kind of like the same highway system that was so handy for Hitler. A great way to invade, so that they would be able to integrate the entire landmass of the entire world. And the most recent expression was the pact signed between Xi and Putin. And in the pact, they say they want Europe to be a part, and at first, they're just going to be welcome to be integrated, but eventually we have to dispense with the inconvenient national borders. And I'll leave it at that.
Yes, I have nothing to add because I've read Dugin in original, and even though he's not that kind of influential in the Kremlin as many outside of the Kremlin claim, but they read, of course, their own theoretical thought, and it is much more serious than we anticipate, because we willingly decided to neglect these processes, whether it's about the philosophical and theoretical part of the discourse, or whether it's about the strategy part, like you mentioned, for instance, the Gerasimov doctrine, whether it's a doctrine or not, because I would just argue that it's adaptation and, adaptation to the new reality, learning from the best, what has worked in the past, and just adapting it to the necessities and the goals of Russia. And yes, sorry to if I have to further create some negative emotions here, but the Russian approach, starting with the 24th of February 2022, has never been just about Ukraine. It has been right from the beginning about the whole of Europe, and you can subjugate. And you can create new facts on the ground without even the necessity of waging a conventional war. I mean, the best war strategists are those who actually manage to subjugate an enemy without the need to fight a war. And yes, it is derived from the school of thought, military thought, theoretical premises, and philosophical thought over a span of 35 years after 1990 in Russia. Whoever is at the top of the system in the Kremlin, because Putin to me is just the facade, the manifestation of a much more comprehensive, serious phenomenon, which is the system behind Putin. So whoever is on the top is not so important. What's important is the system, and this system that has established itself has never accepted the new place Russia was given following the collapse of the Soviet Union. As simple as that. So it's not just about Ukraine, it's about the long game. And here, I would argue they've done their homework to track all these systemic shifts, whereas we were sitting comfortably and were riding the wave of victory for 35 years, expecting that there would be never ever, that there would be an end of history and everybody else would accept us as, as the sole victor, as the partner of the only victor of the Cold War, which was the United States. So I can only agree with what you said. And speaking of Europe as being a target, here this is a comprehensive, long-term approach that, yes, entails weaponization of migration waves. And here, sitting here, you have to be fully aware that one of the weaponizations of migration waves will be coming from Africa, from North Africa, and from the Sahel region, where they have successfully, even after the mutiny of Prigozhin, they have successfully taken over. Right now, most of the operations on the ground in African countries are fully under the control of the state, under the control of the military intelligence and Ministry of Defense. The point here is it's weaponization of migration waves, it's nuclear blackmail, it's weaponization of geo-economic interdependencies, whether I will add, energy premium because now we have to bypass our own sanctions because we still are in need of these resources. So if we are to get the Russian petrochemicals, that means non-Russian petrochemicals, which were produced with Russian oil, and then claim that it's worth to pay the threefold of it, we have to make sense, first and foremost, I would say, of the systemic processes happening, and then we have to decide what's worth doing in this situation, instead of just willfully neglecting the reality as it is. And then, of course, it is about the gray zone hybrid warfare. I mean, we've never been at that highest, at the level of that highest number of operations. Alone in 2025, according to GlobSec, from January to September, 110 hybrid operations, large hybrid operations were conducted, which could be verified, were conducted actually on European soil. The numbers are quite telling.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. I really liked it. A couple of points, I'll make them very short. One is probably going to elicit a big, longer answer, and the other one is going to be probably very short. First one, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the long telegram that defined the strategy of the Cold War. 3 years ago, there was a longer telegram published, I think it was in Politico, and it was widely publicized. It certainly talked about containing China. It talked about defining very clear red lines that would, the United States was basically define the red lines and fight tooth and nail to keep them. So, for example, it was mentioning Taiwan. It was talking about strengthening the bloc around the United States precisely to contain China. If you compare that with the strategy the Trump administration has followed for the last 10 months, I would say it's exactly the opposite, because yes, they have confronted China, but it's antagonized its allies. In fact, we were talking about tariffs, but a lot of tariffs have been imposed on its allies. And on the other hand, it favors, for example, Russia, which, as you said, is never going to leave the side of China. It has too many interests there. So favoring in Russia against its allies looks like, and antagonizing its allies, it looks like it's taking a strategy radically opposite to what the longer telegram and what you might say common sense is suggesting. That's the first one. Second one is a smaller one. It's about the reference currency in the world. You were talking about the dollarization and de-dollarization. The key, the key to reference currency is two things. It has to be abundant. That's why the Swiss franc is never going to be, because there's not enough of them. And it has to be very reliable in terms of its acquisitive power. Because between two countries, the problem is not the bartering. I could buy, but the problem is that one of them is going to have deficit and the other one surplus. Someone has to lend that difference. And the lender wants to lend in a reliable currency. That's why 2 years ago, when the dollar was so high, the Brazilian government started to talk about using yuan or whatever. It never worked, because ultimately they need to borrow in that currency and someone has to be willing to lend. Therefore, I would be skeptical on that, because the yuan is too dependent on the policy of the Chinese government to be reliable on that. So, and a bartering has the problem that someone has to end up lending. Certainly, that links again to the Trump policy, because if Trump manages to take over the Federal Reserve and destroy the credibility of the US dollar, then certainly that scenario could happen. Anyway, two things that for you to comment if you can.
So you mean 2 more hours of presentation of how to come up with a short answer to 2 very complex questions. Maybe I will start with the second one. What I'm currently looking at, where I mostly look for a certain set of indicators, variables I could track, and would consider being helpful in, let's say, finding out whether there would be a kind of shift, is not the yuan, or how, the yuan is internationally not really being traded that much. It's very, very minor share. So that's not the indicator that I'm looking at. I'm looking at a situation, and I agree with you, China cannot go into the deficit mode. That's just not to be expected. So one way I came up with a possible scenario, again, just a scenario, is, for instance, to look at an institutional approach. Remember how the IMF actually was facilitated to basically give loans to third countries through the SDR basket. And the SDR basket was, and is still consisting of several currencies. So what I'm expecting that it might happen is a certain sort of institutional basket. For instance, the Indians will never agree on a trade, for instance, with Russia, which is now increasing, to be facilitated in Chinese yuan, because the Russians are demanding that from the Delhi government for the sake of their own interest. They could buy many things with the yuan, but they cannot buy many things with the rupee. But if we have like an institutional basket consisting of several, different currencies, and then you have commodities, and I would argue that you should also pay attention to what's happening in this domain when it comes to gold, when it comes to silver, when it comes to other metals, and then we have critically important commodities like rare earths, which are now also being considered as a kind of new currency because of the leverage. And then you have like the barter option, because I have this, I have fertilizers, you have, for instance, commodity that's important to me. So the currency itself is not longer that important. We are now sliding into a context which is, very much about, again, commodification. So if you are in possession or you're able to produce critically important commodities, this makes you or turns you into a powerhouse. And in that sense, some sort of BRICS plus, meanwhile we have the very fact that more and more countries want to join from the Middle East, from North Africa, from Southeast Asia. This year in 2025, Indonesia joined. I will be very carefully observing processes linked to this kind of processes. What if there would be a BRICS plus kind of basket, which is then enabling loans, and you get the idea. So that is what I think is more relevant than scale of or share of dollarization versus non-dollarization. And then you have, of course, the very fact that we are right now in again competition between two mindsets and two different narratives and two different strategies. One being of introducing cryptocurrencies, that's the mindset of this US administration, versus centralization of power, that is the digital currency, which is controlled by a central bank. That's Chinese, that's the Russian solution. They are now actually testing their own digital currencies initiated by the central bank. And now I'm asking myself, why is it that we Europeans, with our European Central Bank, are actually on the side of the Chinese and the Russian project, instead of finding ways how to actually come up with probably more adequate solutions? I mean, that worries me, that we are coming up with solutions that we are finding in our competitors. Okay, first question, I was very much hoping that there will be no question about Biden. As a strategist, as a geopolitical strategist, and I'm very open about it and very transparent, so I have no problem of saying it openly. I found Biden administration in the field of foreign and security policy as the most disastrous administration for the American interests all over the world, not only related to the Russian war against Ukraine, the most disastrous foreign policy, which of course had immediate negative impact also on the European partners. It allowed the European partners to free ride, and just because they were not pushed to do anything differently, they were happy. And even worse, they were pretending that everything was all right in Washington, which I will never forgive. Never forgive. For nobody, I mean, we are democracies, that we're not even actually allowed to say openly that there was a problem in Washington. Yes? Now post factum, everybody can claim that there was a problem, right? But that doesn't count. That doesn't count anymore. So the duo, the tandem between the Foreign Secretary and the NSA was just, I think it will go into the history books. It will be given as an example how disastrous actually the foreign and the security portfolio could be from a position of strength. So that doesn't mean that I actually agree with the Trump administration, and you gave a very good example. How is this administration supposed to actually win competition when it weakens its most reliable? Let's say it's not the most reliable partner. I would say it's one of the most strategically important partners here on this side of the Atlantic. And here the opinions contradict, and I share the opinion that, yes, I understand that the Americans can no longer be simultaneously involved on two different war terrains. I do understand the limitations, but I would argue, and because this administration has this mindset, they no longer want and are willing and are able to get involved on two war terrains simultaneously. That means Eastern Europe and Indo-Pacific. And I've been having this discussion with representatives, and people who are close to this administration for several years now. And I said that okay, let me explain what they're doing. They're doing now through pressure and coercion what they consider not being possible through the force of conviction. This administration thinks the least of us in terms of being able to be a reliable partner that can take care of the Eastern European arena. Not only Ukraine, but also taking care of our own defense. That's what they're telling us. I don't want to address the political and the ideological components. I'm just remaining in the security and defense field. So instead of now playing this blaming game, why don't we turn the coin and say, how can we become the reliable partner? And how can we actually take care of our responsibilities? Because we want the freedoms and we want the rights, but we want someone else to take care of the responsibilities. Why not becoming the desirable and reliable partner of the Americans? And I think that the problem lies somewhere else. I think that the problem lies in the political and the ideological domain rather than in the security and defense domain. And so long as this mindset is missing, there will be the expectation that somebody else has to be in charge for our own security and our own defense. And let's be real, it was our weakness before 2022 that invited the Russian aggressiveness. It was our weakness, it was the expectation that we would do nothing to prevent the war from happening. Right now, as we speak, following the 28 points plan, I think we have all the proof for that. But I do not share this assessment on behalf of Trump administration. I do not share the assessment that through coercion and through pressuring on a precious ally, they will achieve the desired outcome. They want to withdraw and they want to focus on China and on the Indo-Pacific, and in the process they might, this could be the unanticipated, undesired outcome, they might actually hit too hard a valuable partner. That's us. And I don't know how we will be still, able to recover from that, whether we will be able to recover from that. So my recommendation would be still to try a middle way, especially when it comes to Central, Eastern Europe and the North. Especially when it comes to the Eastern flank, my recommendation to this administration would be to remain on the ground and make sure that there is a kind of smooth transition when it comes to the responsibilities.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that we don't have any more time to continue. Now that we will have the lunch break, and we will get back on the third panel more or less at 2:45 or 14:40, just an hour from now. Yeah. And thank you very much.